When you're talking about forgotten 80s movies, you're usually talking about movies that studios just didn't know what to do with. I mean, how do you sell people on a horror film that ends in a literal human orgy? Or a Cold War movie that scared a whole town into calling the cops? Or a musical with Danny Elfman playing Satan in blackface? You don't. These movies weren't exactly easy to market, but that's why we're still talking about them. So here you go, 10 hidden gems from the 80s that blew our collective minds. Forget the remake ever happened. This came out right in the thick of Hollywood's Cold War paranoia, when everyone was worried the Russians were going to invade. And that's exactly what happens here. Except the ones fighting back aren't soldiers, they're literally high school kids with hunting rifles, pistols, and bows and arrows. You've got Patrick Swayze, Charlie Sheen, Leah Thompson, Jennifer Grey. It's a killer cast. And this was actually the first movie ever to get a PG-13 rating, created specifically because of how intense and violent it was. The whole story was inspired by a real 1980 military scenario, actual training scenario the Army published. Director John Milius basically took that, rewrote it to fit his own kind of survivalist pro-military ideas, and turned it into what he called a flag-waving patriotic movie. They used real National Guard troops and even borrowed Soviet tanks and helicopters from military supplies. It looked so realistic that during filming, the locals in Las Vegas saw all these actors in Soviet uniforms, freaked out, and actually called the cops, thinking it was a real invasion. This is the Scorsese movie nobody ever talks about. After Hours is basically a black comedy about a guy, played by Griffin Dunne, who goes out on a date in New York, and from there the night just completely falls apart, and then gets worse. This wasn't even a movie Scorsese planned on making. He wanted to do Last Temptation of Christ first, but the studio killed it at the last minute. So he was desperate for something, anything, that would keep him in the game. A tiny indie branch at Warner Brothers finally agreed to do it, but they told him he had exactly 5 weeks to shoot it, no second chances. Scorsese wouldn't even let Griffin Dunne sleep properly while shooting. He wanted him to look genuinely exhausted. So Dunne was awake for days at a time, and the screenplay was from some random 26-year-old word processor salesman who, as it turned out, had actually stolen big parts of it from a radio monologue without permission. The radio guy sued. Scorsese almost got dragged into the whole mess, but it somehow came out fine. Alien Nation is pretty much a classic buddy cop story, except one cop is human and the other is literally an alien refugee named Sam Francisco. James Caan is the human cop, Mandy Patinkin is his alien partner, and they're investigating murders in a futuristic version of LA that's suddenly full of alien refugees from a UFO landing in the Mojave Desert. Originally, the studio wanted Arnold Schwarzenegger and Eddie Murphy to star, but then the budget got tight, the script got rewritten last minute, and they went smaller. James Caan openly hated being in this movie. He argued with the director constantly, refused to rehearse, and even walked off set twice. The alien makeup was awful to deal with too. Mandy Patinkin said the glue they used actually burned his skin behind his ears. And the whole aliens as immigrants thing was supposed to be way more political. The director shot a bunch of scenes about racism and immigration, but the studio thought it was too risky and forced him to cut a lot of it. When it came out, it was a surprise cult hit. But James Caan's opinion never changed. He called it a piece of shit that he actually forgot he'd made. Society is one of those horror movies where words don't do it justice. You kinda just have to see it. It's basically a satire on America's class system, but with crazy special effects from Screaming Mad George, who was like the master of surreal, disgusting 80s gore. There's this famous ending sequence with an orgy, the shunting, where a secret group of super rich people literally start melting into each other and feeding off a poor kid. It's just totally nuts and completely gross, but it works because it's so over-the-top weird. No American studio wanted anything to do with this. They literally called it unsellable and too disgusting. So the director went over to Japan, convinced one of their oldest studios to pay for the whole thing, and got it made. Even then, when it was finished back in '89, no distributor in the US wanted their name on it, so it sat unreleased for 3 years before anyone here even saw it. If you know horror, You probably know Bernard Rose from Candyman, but before that he made Paperhouse. And this thing is genuinely creepy. It's about a girl, Anna, who's sick and stuck in bed. She starts drawing pictures and then begins having these really intense dreams where she's inside her own drawings. The producers originally tried to push Rose into making this a nice, safe, kid-friendly movie. But he pushed back. He wanted it dark, because it was based on a super creepy 1950s children's novel called Marianne Dreams, which was actually banned in some schools at the time. They cast a 12-year-old girl named Charlotte Burke, total unknown, no acting experience, just from a casting call, and she's amazing in it. And that's the only movie she ever did. The score, by the way, was done by Hans Zimmer before Hollywood knew his name. It's haunting stuff. Just a genuinely weird, dark little gem more people need to see. Forbidden Zone started out as a weird stage show from a performance group called the Mystic Knights, and then Richard Elfman, Danny Elfman's brother, turned it into a completely insane movie. The plot barely matters here. It's got something to do with a woman lost in the sixth dimension, but mostly it's just completely bizarre, raunchy sketches with some pretty wild musical numbers thrown in. Danny Elfman actually shows up as the devil and sings a Cab Calloway song in blackface, and of course that scene got them into all sorts of trouble. Elfman shot the whole movie in his garage, using old costumes and leftover sets from other movies. Nobody wanted to release it, mostly because of that blackface scene, which ended up censored, banned, protested, the whole thing. A couple of years ago, Elfman digitally changed it to clownface to try and cool things down a bit. People called the movie anti-Christian, anti-Semitic, even homophobic. Elfman says none of that was on purpose. He was just making something absurd, inspired by stuff like German expressionism and old cartoons. Still, probably couldn't make this one today. This one's pretty much a classic 80s teen movie, but with a twist. John Cusack, he was only 17 when they made it, plays Gib, this guy traveling cross-country to meet up with a girl in California who's supposed to be a guaranteed hookup. Allison is traveling along with him to see her boyfriend. You can guess how it goes. They start out hating each other, then things change along the way. The script actually came from a true story. The writer took a cross-country rideshare trip, hooked up with a girl he met out west, and then never saw her again. Rob Reiner directed this right after making Spinal Tap, and the studio wasn't into it. They told Reiner he wasn't young or hip enough for a teen movie, so he basically told them, fine, don't pay me until it makes money. That convinced them. This is probably the only good Western from the 80s, and of course it's got Clint Eastwood. He stars, directs, produces, does everything here. It's basically one of those mysterious stranger rides into town and cleans things up stories, except this time he might actually be a ghost, or some kind of preacher who's come back from the dead to protect these gold miners from greedy land barons trying to push them out. Eastwood only agreed to do this movie if he got total creative freedom, no studio meddling at all. When a big investor bailed halfway through, Eastwood actually put $1 million of his own money into finishing the film. They built the entire mining town set from scratch in Idaho, then burned it down for the movie. And apparently the gunshots during filming were so loud, they set off car alarms like 10 miles away. This one's about a man named Travis, played by Harry Dean Stanton, who's been wandering through the desert for years. Finally, he decides to come back and tries to reconnect with his family, especially his estranged wife. This movie ended up inspiring so many things. U2's Joshua Tree album, bands like Travis and Texas even named themselves after it. Kurt Cobain and Elliott Smith both called it their favorite movie ever. Harry Dean Stanton had been acting for like 30 years, but this was his first ever lead role. Wim Wenders cast him after hearing him drunkenly sing Mexican songs at a party. The script was by Sam Shepard, but Stanton improvised most of his lines, including this famous monologue scene at a peep show, done all in one take. The whole movie was filmed on an actual 10,000-mile road trip, just driving west to east across the country, filming in real locations, no sets at all. Richard E. Grant plays an advertising exec who suddenly grows this disgusting talking boil on his shoulder. The boil grows its own little suit, starts giving him advice, and eventually tries to completely take over his life. Bruce Robinson, the director, was the guy behind Withnail and I, and he wrote this movie specifically as an attack on advertising and Thatcher-era capitalism. Basically, he got the idea after working briefly in advertising himself, and he hated it so much he wanted to get revenge. Robinson actually wrote most of this movie during a cocaine binge after months spent obsessively studying real ad campaigns. The movie came out, and MGM completely buried it. They gave it no advertising, pulled it from theaters after like 2 weeks, and basically just dumped it. Richard E. Grant later said they treated it like toxic waste. Criterion eventually restored it using Robinson's own VHS tapes as a guide because naturally the studio lost their notes.